Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Ife Lee. I am a member of the faculty at the NYU Department of Environmental Studies. A very warm welcome from Shanghai to our participants from all over the world. This is the last panel of the conference on the geopolitics and ecology of melting mountains. The title of the panel is Contested Waters, China-India Environmental Politics on the Roof of the World. I want to take this opportunity to thank a number of institutions that made possible today's event. They are NYU Abu Dhabi, the Rachel Carson Center in LMU Munich, the Center for Global Asia of NYU, and the Earth Humanities Initiatives at NYU Abu Dhabi. I wanted now to invite the panelists to join the call. The format of today's event is the following. To open the panel, each of our 4 speakers will give a 5-minute presentation on some of their research that speaks to China-India environmental politics in the Himalayan region. After the 4 opening presentations, I'll ask a couple of questions to try and delve deeper into some of those issues. At that point, I ask that members of the audience to please send in your questions through the Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We will bring this panel to conclusion at approximately the 1-hour mark. I'm incredibly grateful for this opportunity to moderate the panel, not least because we have a truly impressive lineup of speakers, including Judith Shapiro of American University and Brian Eiler of the Stimson Center, both of whom are joining us from Washington, D.C. We also have Brian Tilt of Oregon State University joining us from the West Coast of the United States, and Selena Ho joining us from the same time zone as I am, but we are 2,000 miles apart from each other. She's at the National University of Singapore. Thank you all so very much for joining our call, and especially thank you to Brian Tilt. I know it's very early, it's just past 7 a.m. In your part of the world, so thank you so much for joining us. Now, without further ado, I want to turn everything over to our speakers. So our first speaker on the panel today is Dr. Judith Shapiro. She's director of the master's program in natural resources and sustainable development and chair of the global environmental politics program at the School of International Studies at American University in DC. She was one of the first Americans to live in China after US-China foreign relations were normalized in 1979. She's the author, co-author, or editor of 9 books, including, most recently, China Goes Green, Coercive Environmentalism for a Troubled Planet, which she and I co-wrote. Judy is going to talk about the importance of harnessing the water to the Chinese state. I now turn it over to Dr. Judith Shapiro.
Hi, everybody. It's an incredible honor to be here. Thank you, Ife. Thank you, the other organizers. I'm not strictly speaking a Himalayas specialist. I've visited Tibet. I've been in Shanghai. I've been in northern Yunnan, and I've been following these issues for quite a while. But my presentation today is going to be a little general. Hope that I'll be able to set things up for the other panelists. And I want to underline that contested waters are not only internationally contested, they're also contested within China. So I have a little slideshow for you. I hope you will like it. Yeah, and this is the cover of the book that Ife and I did. So we want to do a little advertisement. All right, so oopsie, I'm not advancing. Let me try sharing a different screen. I'm sorry. Let's see if this will advance. Yes, this will advance. Okay, so the first sort of fundamental thing we all know already, but I want to mention here, is that whoever controls the headwaters of the rivers controls the river. And China happens to control the Himalayan plateau, also known as the water tower of the world, or the third pole. And that affects Southeast Asia deeply, it affects South Asia deeply. And of course, it also affects the downstream rivers of China itself. So this is a critical issue, and other panelists will talk about this more. Sorry, why am I not advancing? Okay, so water is central to Chinese government legitimacy. It goes way back. Da Yu, or Yu the Great, is the legendary founder of China. And essentially, if you can't control the waters, you're out of luck, you're out of power, it's often the end of your dynasty. So Yu conquered the flood. And way back in the day, you know, at 3,300 BC, the great waterworks projects of the central government, some of them are still working well today, like Dujiangyan, very famous. The waters are China's sorrow as well as China's pride. Here's a picture of the Yellow River flood. So again, this gets to the centrality of water control. Here we have Chairman Mao announcing his return to power at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. It's no accident that he chose to do that by going for a swim. He's showing that he still harnessed the waters. And here's his famous poem, which is sort of his dream of the Three Gorges Dam that wasn't achieved until after he passed away. So the water challenges within China revolve around pollution and accidents. And because I only have 5 minutes, I'm going to zip through these. But the pollution is very intense in China, as you see. There are many industrial accidents that kill fish, and the access to clean water is very, very limited, right? So we see that many people don't have access to clean drinking water, yeah. And the pollution worsens the water shortages that are already acute. Here we have an algae bloom in Lake Tai, and you can see a Ting, I don't know, the Ding or Ting River spill. So this is a big issue. So we want to think about the citizen response and the anxiety about whether they have access to clean water. So there are lots of campaigns by NGOs, such as this is a Greenpeace campaign to get companies to stop dumping toxic chemicals into the upper reaches of the Yangtze River, the detox campaign. So they will shame these companies like Zara. And of course, Zara doesn't want this kind of image out there, so they commit to stop doing it. Another example of citizen power has to do with information transparency. This is the famous Ma Jun from IPE, and he has pioneered a water pollution map. And we can also see examples of citizen science where citizens can actually take water samples, or nowadays they use something called the Black and Smelly Waters app, where they can actually take a photograph, give them their own geolocation, and ask the government to investigate. So this is a very powerful kind of way for citizens to try to get a little cleaner water. So then the key issue for us who are, as we look at the Himalayas, is climate change, and why does it that Beijing should care, right? Because for most ordinary Chinese people, climate change is a kind of arm's length issue. But Beijing cares because the glacier melts mean more floods. They mean ultimately after all of that melting, the aquifers are falling, there are water shortages that could exacerbate citizen discontent. Beijing is very, very water short. We could be looking at so-called environmental refugees from Beijing. So it could be the displacement of literally millions and millions of people. Sea level rise affecting Shanghai, Guangzhou, Tianjin, and the increase in extreme weather events. So Beijing, I think maybe others will speak about this, but the pictures of the glacier melts in the Himalayas are very concerning, it's very rapid. And this is only from 2005, so there's much worse pictures for later. The aquifer system has been declining in the North China Plain very dramatically over time. Here we have a drought in Yunnan province, also related to climate change. So I want to talk about what the state is doing. This is part of the book that Ife and I did. So this is really amazing stuff. So there are these silver iodide shooting machines, and they've already installed 500 of them in mostly Qinghai to try to catch the monsoons as they come up from China. You shoot silver iodide into the air, that makes it rain, catches some of that Indian water, and tries to ultimately modify the very weather on the Tibetan Plateau as a way of counterbalancing some of this glacier melt. So this is a wild and fascinating thing. Ultimately, the plan is to have something like 10,000 of these. So, and then just to set up the next speakers, there's a huge emphasis on hydropower as a way of increasing the percentage of renewable energy, especially in light of the commitment to go carbon neutral by 2060. And I'm just showing some images here because I think maybe the next speakers who are going to be talking about dams may not have the same images to share. So the New River, of course, is a very, very famous campaign by activists to try to keep the government from building dams on it. Originally, there were 13 dams that were going to be built. I think they reduced that to something like 5. Some of these river champions, you know, Save the Rivers in China, Green Watershed in Yunnan, all of these people are ultimately dealing with waters that are coming down from the Himalayan plateau. This Tiger Leaping Gorge Dam, very famous site. This was stopped by a heroic journalist, Liu Jianqiang, who ultimately lost his job at Southern Weekend and had to, he worked for a while at China Dialogue and I believe now lives in California. So the problem for journalists has been that there's some space for covering these environmental stories, but they have to be really careful about them. He did manage to stop that Tiger Leaping Gorge Dam on the grounds that they hadn't conducted a good environmental impact assessment, but unfortunately that dam is being built again now under another name closer to Lijiang. So the transboundary impacts of all of this, again, I think other speakers are going to address this, but just to give you a taste, the downriver communities are protesting some of these dams that are funded with Chinese money, and the electricity is destined to be sold in China. So here are the Karen people who are protesting a dam on the Salween. Here's a protest led by monks over a dam funded by China in Cambodia. And I was so excited about having only 5 minutes that I've barreled through. So I think I must have met my deadline because I didn't get a 1 minute warning. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to more.
Thank you so much for Judy for such a comprehensive coverage of all of these related matters in just 5 minutes. And also the discussion about dams actually set us up very nicely for our next speaker. That is Brian Tilt, who is an environmental anthropologist who specializes in the human dimensions of natural disasters and sustainable development in contemporary China, where serious environmental problems have taken on global importance. Many of his research projects have applied outcomes, and he is interested in working with community members to shape policies that promote both human welfare and environmental sustainability. He is currently at the anthropology department at Oregon State University. Brian is going to comment on hydropower dams and the implications for ecological systems, resettled populations, and river flows. I now turn it over to Professor Brian Tilt.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ife, and thank you to the other panel organizers. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, even if it's early in the morning for me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's okay. And I hope everyone can see this, okay. I'm just going to talk a little bit about my research on hydropower dams and some of the social and ecological effects of those. So I'm an anthropologist, and that generally means that we tend to focus our research on rather small scales at the community level, for example. So I first became interested in the effects of dams in the early 2000s, I was doing research in Sichuan and Yunnan in Southwest China on other topics. And I kept hearing from people about dam construction and about, for example, villagers having to move out when reservoirs filled up and that sort of thing. And that got me interested in the topic. And so I've been involved in this kind of research for 10 or 15 years. And a lot of it is interdisciplinary, working with economists and geographers and so forth. Most of my research has been in Southwest China on the upper Mekong, which is also called the Lancang in Chinese, and then the New River, which downstream in Southeast Asia is called the Xiaowan. And we conducted case studies on what happens socially and ecologically when dams are built. And some of you may know this, and for others it might not be intuitive, but dams essentially fragment the river ecosystem. So if you have fish species that are migratory, that disrupts that. It can have effects on water quality and temperature, effects on local species in the area. And then from a social standpoint, especially if a dam has a large reservoir behind it, you lose that land for human livelihood activities like farming and fishing and so forth. And so a lot of this research has been focused on trying to understand those impacts. And after a few years of focusing at the case study level, which is what we do in anthropology, people kept asking me, what conclusions can we draw from your work about the impacts of dams more broadly? And I kind of thought, well, not much, because the cultural and political contexts are so unique. And so I took that as an empirical challenge and started building this dam impacts database about 5 years ago. And it's now online, and this is still very much a work in progress, but most of the data is accessible through this mapping feature that sort of plots over 500 dams around the world. And I'm going to zoom in on the Himalayan region here. You'll see that we actually don't have some data from some of these newer dams. One of the areas of contestation here is on the Brahmaputra. The upstream portion of that in China is called the Yarlung-Zangpo. And there are 2 dams that have been built by Chinese companies so far, with several others planned. And that causes concern downstream in India for things like water security, for example. And as Judy mentioned, the upstream riparian country has a real geopolitical advantage because they essentially control the downstream flows. I'll just zoom in a little more so you can kind of see some of these dams that we've been working on. This one is the Manwan Dam. This is the first dam that was constructed on the Lancang River, the upper portion of the Mekong in China. And we have sort of basic geographic information, and then we have information about population resettlement, compensation, for example. And these are all areas of research within this field of dams and displacement. To give you an idea of how important this has become in China, during the 12th five-year plan, which was 2011 to 2015, China built enough hydropower capacity to basically equal 1 Three Gorges dam every year. So most of the dams constructed during that period were not nearly on the scale of the Three Gorges Dam, but there were so many of them that the actual hydropower capacity was roughly equal to that. So a couple of questions going forward. What will climate change mean for things like hydropower? Because these rivers are, the climate forecasts call for melting glaciers and variability in the precipitation patterns. What will that mean for river flows and hydropower? And then what will that mean for the geopolitical relationship between China and India when the upstream country is able to control some of these rivers? What will that mean for international relations, for example? So I'll go ahead and stop my comments there and look forward to more discussion on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing with us the information about your database. I hope a lot more people can begin to utilize that database for their own work. And also your comment about the Brahmaputra River issue actually sets up us nicely for the third speaker on the panel. That's Selena Ho, who is assistant professor and chair of the Masters in International Affairs program at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. She researches and writes on Chinese politics and foreign policy, specifically analyzing Chinese state power through the lens of infrastructure politics and water disputes. Most of her work examines China's relations with its neighbors, particularly China-India and China-Southeast Asia relations. Selena is the author, co-author, and editor of 3 books, including Thirsty Cities, Social Contracts and Public Goods Provision in China and India, which, by the way, is a great book. She will share with us her insights on the lack of cooperation between the 2 riparian states of China and India along the Brahmaputra River. Professor Selena Ho.
Thank you, Ife. And thank you for the invitation to be here. And I'm really pleased to be sharing a panel with all these great speakers, people whose works I've read when I was a student, and also more recently your work, and then Brian's work. So I'm very pleased and honored to be here. And thank you to audience from different parts of the world, whatever time zone you're in. Appreciate you being here. So let me just share screen right now, so I think that the previous speakers, Judith and Brian, actually did a really fantastic job in setting this up. So I can actually just zoom in on the Brahmaputra. Now, but before I do that, I just want to say that in terms of river disputes, what I'm really interested in is in issues like power asymmetries, hydrohegemony, and securitization and desecretization of water disputes. So the focus is really from an international politics kind of perspective. So let me focus just on the Brahmaputra itself. And let me set it up by saying that, what are some of the interests, what are China's interests with respect to the Brahmaputra, and what are India's interests with respect to the Brahmaputra. So for China, its goals are really twofold. And I think that Brian before me actually put it up very nicely when he shared his database, is power, hydropower. There is a power shortage in Tibet, okay? So building some significant dams on the mainstream of the Yalongzangpu, as it's known in China, in Tibet. There is the Zhangmu Dam, and there's also a more recently commissioned dam known as the Jiata Dam. So this dam building concerns India. As the Brahmaputra, you can see from this map, enters into India through a disputed territory known as Arunachal Pradesh. So this is, the water issues all mixed up with the border dispute between China and India. And the other is to ensure the security of Tibet. So in that sense, not only is the Brahmaputra involved in China's border disputes with India, it's also involved in the management of Tibet. Now, hence the Brahmaputra is really a national security issue for China. Now for India, the Brahmaputra is significant in terms of the livelihoods of the people who actually live in the northeast of Arunachal Pradesh and Assam, all disputed territories. They're significant for the livelihoods of the tribes there, the minority tribes there. So, it's the rice bowl, okay, of the northeast, and agriculture, irrigation, transportation, fishing, all the forms of livelihoods that are important for communities in those regions. So, one of my field trips was to the northeast of the Brahmaputra. And when speaking to the minority groups there, the tribes there, one of the things they always talk about is the issue of flooding in the embankment areas. So, and they refer to these floods as China floods. So in that sense, there is that, that impression that it is Chinese actions in the upper riparian, as an upper riparian that led to the floods that are quite common actually in that area. Now, so let me try and share the results of a survey that me and two other co-authors actually wrote, did a survey, and that the survey findings have actually been published in a paper, and I'll share the citations and references for the paper in a bit in the chat box. The thing that we're really interested in was to try and answer this question: why do China and India desecuritize their water dispute, and why, despite desecuritization, cooperation has actually remained low? Why is this a puzzle in the first place, right? So if we look at all the disputes between China and India, whether it's Tibet, whether it's the border dispute, everything has been securitized. But the Chinese and Indian government has made extra efforts actually to desecuritize their water dispute. And they do it despite water being really an issue that's easy to securitize. So securitization is the use of rhetoric to move an issue from what is normal in politics to something that is in the military and security realm. So it is about painting water as an existential threat. So that water is an existential threat. It affects our lives, and it is basic for us to live on. So it is easy to paint it as a security threat. But China and India actually moved to desecuritize the water dispute. But the other puzzle to this is, why is it that despite desecuritization, cooperation has been low? Cooperation has remained technically at the technical level, and it only comprises expert level mechanism and a hydrological data sharing. So very technical and very low when it comes to different levels of cooperation that's possible between riparians. So me and my co-authors actually did a Q survey of China-India water experts. And now what is the Q methodology? It actually uncovers the debates and the beliefs surrounding the China-India water dispute. So it puts all these viewpoints on relative to one another. So the results of the survey is that the three prominent ideas actually emerge. It's collaboration, development, and threat perception. So the people in the survey rank collaboration as number one, followed by development, and then threat perception. So in trying to answer the question, why did the two sides desecuritize? The findings of the survey actually really help to explain this puzzle. So among the Chinese respondents, there is quite an important view that displayed relative sensitivity to Indian concerns, and which sought to reduce Indian threat perception. So Chinese scholars have actually emphasized the importance of building trust on both sides. Now, this is not a view that I think you hear very often, that comes up from whether the Chinese side or whether the Indians believe the Chinese to be sensitive to their concerns. Now, on the Indian side, the Indian government could be motivated to desecuritize because the securitization narrative actually came from the local politicians in the Northeast as well as activists. And this securitization narrative is actually aimed at the central government. So by desecuritizing, the Indian government actually is hoping to lessen the significance of the water dispute and reduce pressure itself. Now, so the second part of the question that we try to answer is why, despite this desecuritization, why there is a low level of cooperation. And this can also be explained by the survey results. The analysis shows that desecuritization does not really lead to better cooperation because there is a threat perception that still persists. So desecuritization actually did not do anything for reducing threat perception, whether it's from the Chinese side or the Indian side. And cooperation is really difficult because having that level of trust is actually essential as a first step for cooperation. There is also the traditional view. There is also that conflict between those who favor development and those who favor ecological protection that makes cooperation on ecological protection difficult. Now, the point here is that there is this traditional view that desecularization is actually a normative good and could lead to more genuine cooperation. But the finding of the results of the survey results is that this really does not bear out. So the other thing about desecularization is that if we desecularize too much, it becomes depoliticized. And if it becomes depoliticized, it remains then just as a technical issue. So that means that the attentions of politicians are not on resolving the issue itself. It's left to the technical experts to deal with the problem. So the challenge actually facing the expert communities in both countries is to keep the dispute politicized and relevant, and so that the root reasons for the dispute can be resolved. I think that's all I have to say, Ife, and thank you very much. I'm going to share the references for this in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Selena. That was very, very informative. Now I'd like to introduce our fourth speaker, Brian Eiler. He is an expert on transboundary issues in the Mekong region and specializes in China's economic cooperation with Southeast Asia. He spent more than 15 years living and working in China, and over the last 2 decades have conducted extensive research with stakeholders in the Mekong region. Brian is the co-chair of the Mekong Basin Connect program and serves as chair of the Stimson Center's War Legacy Working Group. His recent book, Last Days of the Mighty Mekong, has received extensive critical acclaim for its incredibly close observations of those who depend on the river. Brian is going to share with us ways that the Stimson Center has worked to use GIS and remote sensing data to visualize, analyze, and disseminate information about transboundary river impacts. Without further ado, Brian Eiler.
Thank you, Ife, and thank you to Judy and all for inviting me to present today. There's a lot to say about the Mekong, and I've got 5 minutes, so I'm just going to work on talking about our recent work on improving transparency over upstream impacts on the downstream, as well as transparency throughout the entirety of the Mekong Basin, which is a Himalayan river with its headwaters in the Himalaya, and our work on promoting the importance of natural flow throughout the entirety of the river, as well as natural hydrological cycles. And to help think through ways that are becoming very cheaper and cheaper each year, and easier to demonstrate that think tanks, researchers, citizen scientists can use to promote transparency in their parts of the world. So I'm showing you right now very quickly our Mekong Infrastructure Tracker, and this comes out of the USAID Mekong Safeguards Project, which is implemented by the Asia Foundation, and Stimson's key deliverable to date is this Mekong Infrastructure Tracker. And we have a dashboard here that very much like Brian's presentation tracks the development of infrastructure across a number of types of infrastructure in the Mekong countries. One of them is power generation, so hydropower is here. And if we're looking at the map, you can see there's a lot of blue, right? I think we have the most comprehensive map for dams in the 5 Mekong countries, as well as for other forms of power generation. So you can begin to think how these are developing and moving forward. We don't have the rivers on here. I can turn them on, but it's a very dense layer. But you can see going up into China that there's a line of things, and those are dams. Those are dams on the Mekong, and China has 19 planned for its portion of the Mekong, half of which runs through China. And you can use the tracker to get a feel and filter down for just the extent of damming that's happening. So just showing you some of the filters here. We can look at hydropower. We can get a sense for, say, dams that are operational, and show them. And then you can use the tracker to just filter down to, say, one particular basin, just to give you a feel for the number of dams. And there are more than 400 planned for the entirety of the Mekong Basin. You know, this map kind of brings that into perspective, because the Mekong is so rich in natural resources, or natural resource base of water resource provision, that a country like Laos has decided to set its future development and current development trajectory on becoming the battery of Southeast Asia. But But again, looking further, we can just get a feel for the projects that are completed and take a zoom in to look at some of these projects and find out information about them on the tracker. Just by pressing one, you can come up with descriptive information as well as get a look at the dams themselves by changing out base maps. And we feel that the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker is really a way that you can use to find out information on your own about what's happening with these dams upstream. And a lot of this information is not shared with downstream countries. Importantly, in the China context, China holds the information about the operations of its dams and other critical data that's important for downstream very close to its chest, only recently agreeing to share more data with the downstream countries from just 2 stations very close to the borders with Southeast Asia. But earlier this year, shifting into another line of work that we're doing, my team promoted the studies, the findings of an important study produced by a climate consultancy group called Eyes on Earth, which convinced me for the first time that the impacts of China's upstream dams, those 11 completed upstream dams, are critically severe to the downstream. And what the Eyes on Earth team did was used a remote sensing model to develop a natural flow model for how much water should be in the river if dams were not there, affecting the hydrological cycle, and then began to compare that to Mekong River Commission gauge data to see what the gap is. And the results were rather astounding. I mean, the highest level of result is that for the last 2 years now, because some of the data is updated, the downstream countries were going through a severe dry, wet season, if you will. The Mekong thrives on natural flow, a very wet season to produce 20% of the world's freshwater fish catch. But the last 2 have been severely dry. And I mean, lack of rainwater precipitation is definitely the core driver of this. But their study also found that China restricted an incredible amount of water while that downstream was going through a severe drought. And what this looks like, and I'm going quickly just for sake of time, so we can have enough time for discussion, is the blue line on top shows the natural flow model that was determined by Eyes on Earth. And the orange line shows the Mekong River Commission gauge of water that was actually registered at a gauge in Thailand closest to the border with China. So it's really measuring what China's dam impacts are. And then the shaded lines down below show the discrepancy or the deficits when China is restricting water or when China is releasing water. And this is really showing you how the hydrological cycle of the river is being broken. And we can talk more about what the impacts are to breaking the hydrological cycle. But whenever this came out, my team, as well as Eyes on Earth, began to get a lot of questionings and criticisms. I think that overall the story is the results have stuck. But exactly how much water does China contribute to the lower portions of the river? How much does it matter, say, Cambodia, of China's upstream regulations? And then we began to dig into data finding that, at any one time at Vientiane, the capital of Laos, about halfway through the Mekong system, China's contribution to that river is between 38 and 65% of the water in the river. Downstream, it ranges from, say, 13% to 35% of the water in the river. So when you mess with those portions, even if it's low, say 10%, if I impact half of 10% of your salary, you're going to start complaining, right? So these restrictions do matter. And then we dug in more to some of the literature to try and find out really what had happened in 2019. And we found that more dams came online, new markets came online. And for the first time, China Southern Grid and the dam owners were able to optimize cascade operations of their dams. And that's really what caused the deep cuts downstream. Hydropower production and the prioritization of hydropower production. Whether downstream needs were considered, that's something that needs to be explored. But we also began to respond to certain accusations, particularly from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, that said, China was going through a drought at the same time as the downstream countries, and that the reservoirs were at their lowest levels ever. We are able to utilize a free access license to some high resolution satellite imagery that we have to show that indeed that was not necessarily true, that the low levels of the reservoirs happened much earlier in the year in 2019, when these reservoirs were releasing massive amounts of water to produce hydropower. And then they began to turn the tap off. The two major dams, Xiaowan and Norjadu, really restricted their outlets to allow the reservoirs to fill again, and this can be shown through satellite imagery. We took the process a little bit further, began to integrate with GIS analysis, and began to put together readings of how those reservoirs were changing over time. And this is knowledge that had never really been seen before. And we're now able, again, in the interest of time, I'm just going a little bit quickly here, to use that GIS process to develop operations curves for some of these big dams and to disseminate that information to the downstream countries, which really need to know what's happening upstream, when China is restricting its water, when China is releasing water, and to what extent, and what's going to be coming down the pike. We're able now to generate operations curves for all the 11 dams, as well as other major dams downstream in the lower Mekong, and put that together in a cascade view to kind of get a feel for how things change from month to month across the conditions of the river. And I'm just happy to say that this is the first time I'm announcing it. On November 23rd, we are going to be releasing an online platform to improve data transparency over upstream dam operations. This will provide weekly reporting conditions on 28 dams in the Mekong Basin, 11 on the upstream, mainstream in China, and then the remaining on the downstream. And it's all done through open source, transparent processes that other partners can learn about and freely join us in our quest to improve transparency over dam operations in the Mekong. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. This is such a rich presentation that you've given. I truly admire the work that you do at the Stimson Center. And I believe a couple of my students are actually interning at your center, helping with some of the projects. So thank you again so very much. I see that a number of questions have trickled in already. These are great questions. And in the interest of time, I want to combine some of those questions. There are a few that are about China-India relations, issues about data sharing, issues about water conflicts. So I wonder if some of the panelists could comment on how India and China are responding to escalating resource conflicts in general and water conflicts in particular. In other words, how is the status quo unfolding, and how can we imagine a better future, in a future in which the two countries are actually working productively in the interest of sustainability, in the interest of ecology and geopolitical peace in the region? I guess whoever wants to address that question, you could unmute yourself, but I can also ask specific speakers to comment on that. We haven't decided which way to go, but Selena, do you want to comment on some of those issues? What is the current mode of managing conflicts, and what do you think should be a better way for these countries, for India and China, to work together? If you could give a short answer to that question, so that in the interest of entertaining more questions.
Okay, so maybe what I could say, I could talk about what is China's approach and what is India's approach. Well, to not just the Brahmaputra, but in general, the water disputes that they are actually involved in, or the international rivers that crosses their territory. So I would say that China focuses primarily on multilateral development, or bilateral development as well. And for example, in the Mekong, I mean, it's part of the Lantong Mekong Cooperation is actually part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So development is the focus there. And the focus is really on mutual benefits, or the way the Chinese like to call it, win-win solutions, right? And the other thing is that the Chinese actually have never signed any water treaties with any of the other riparian states. So which means that they actually take what is international law known, I'm not an international law expert, but this is what I hear from my friends, is that they take an absolute sovereignty view in the sense that whatever flows into my territory, I can use it the way that I want to. And well, although in practice, I think that the Chinese do restrain themselves to some extent, but they will not want to institutionalize this by, say, signing a water sharing treaty, which is what India does. So India does take a limited sovereignty view in a sense, because it has water treaties with the surrounding countries, with Bangladesh, with Nepal, you know, and so the Ganges Treaty, for instance, they do, so it does sign all these water treaties, but both countries actually would exercise what we call negative leadership, which is the building of dams, and India has plans to do a national river linking project, which has to do with, a lot to do with water diversion projects. So the approach really is not so much about, approaches are different. They both have exercised, you know, positive forms of leadership as well as negative ones, as the, you know, right, as the hydro hegemons in the river systems they're in. So I think that's their general approach. Well, in terms of what they're doing for each other, I don't think there's much that's going on in Brahmaputra, like I was saying, expert level mechanisms and hydrological data sharing. I mean, that's about it. That remains at the technical level.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Brian Eiler, I mean, you've commented on some of the problems that you documented through remote sensing data and GIS platforms. Can you say a little more about what you think should be an equitable way of handling these disputes and conflicts?
Well, I think every river system is different, and I'm by far not an expert on the rivers that flow into South Asian countries. But I know the Mekong is very unique, and it's important to underscore the uniqueness of, say, the Tonle Sap Lake, which is really responsible for producing 20% of the world's freshwater fish catch, and the ecological process that makes the Tonle Sap Lake work and makes the Mekong mighty. And that happens through a flood cycle where the lake expands during the wet season as a result of the tributary that runs out of the lake into the Mekong mainstream reverses direction, sending 50 times as much water that's in the lake during the dry season back into the lake during the wet season. It's a really remarkable process. And showing why that's important, you know, making linkages to, say, that process with Thai stakeholders and Chinese stakeholders, I've had several conversations with high-level Chinese water elite about overdevelopment and the importance of nature-based solutions and how floodplains are productive rather than destructive in the Mekong. And you can make a difference that way. From my perspective, natural flow is really important to promote in the Mekong region. And what these upstream dams are doing is reversing natural flow by restricting water during the wet season and releasing water during the dry season. And Chinese elite are saying, no, that's the right thing for the Mekong. And I cannot think there's anything, that's an incredibly wrong statement for the Mekong itself. So changing minds, changing practices, changing operations is really the only way forward in the Mekong region.
Right, such a great comment. And I see a number of other questions coming in that's clustered around the issue of what can other countries do? What can the international communities do? In other words, countries other than those in the region, the United States, the European Union, and also what are the global implications? Why should everyone outside of this region even tune in to these issues? Why should people care? Judy and Brian Tilt, could the two of you comment on those global implications and what external actors can do in these areas?
My sense is that NGO actors like International Rivers linking with local actors is very powerful, and the work that the two Brians are doing, you know, to get that data out, that's really strong scientific information. That might be in some ways more powerful than anything, say, the United States could have to say about all of this. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that the global understanding of activists of the negative impacts of dams has really been on the upswing. And I know I have a deep concern about the climate change commitments that China is making, because I do think that that's going to justify even more hydropower building. And nobody's yet mentioned, but I should say that this is seismically active part of the world. You get earthquakes there. These dams collapse. It's no accident that that Xiaowan earthquake was happened, you know, upstream of a new dam, and that's water is literally heavy. It's not heavy water in the sense of like a nuclear waste water, but it's literally weighs a lot and it can destabilize plates. So, you know, the social costs also, I think it'd be great, Brian Eiler, if you could also include data about the number of people who were relocated as part of these dams. I don't know how, that must be very hard data to get, but that all helps to raise awareness of the impacts of sort of green grabbing that's going on in this part of the world.
Thank you, Judy. Brian Tilt.
Yeah, I mean, these are really hard questions. And I share Judy's concern that climate change will potentially incentivize more dam building. And what that really underscores for me is the fact that energy production in general is a choice between bad options, right? You know, coal-fired power plants and natural gas, and you know, these are things that hydropower can help us get away from. But then we've got all of these other ecological and social and geopolitical problems that come up. One thing I wanted to underscore, you know, Selena's work is interesting because it ties a river like the Brahmaputra to the border dispute that's happening, right, between Tibet and Arunachal Pradesh, and it brings security into the picture. I think that it's important to realize the interconnections between all of these different things. The two dams on the Brahmaputra so far on the Tibet side, I would point out, I believe those are run-of-the-river dams. So what that means is they're not actually storing a lot of water the way that Brian showed on the Mekong with dams with very large reservoirs. So the dams on the Brahmaputra so far are just running the water through turbines and releasing it downstream. And so, but the fear of downstream countries like India is that, you know, maybe there will be larger dams built with reservoirs. There's also fear of the possibility of water diversion projects. You know, China is famous for these large scale engineering projects like the South to North Water Transfer Project. That is an interbasin transfer between the Yangtze and then up to the North China Plain. And there's fear that, well, maybe something like that could happen on the Brahmaputra, that is literally diverting the water and lessening the availability of water downstream.
Right. Yeah, those are
Brian,
really tough
just
issues.
to add in there, I'm glad you brought up run-of-the-river dams and the lower hydrological impact that they have. And that's certainly playing out in the lower Mekong, where most of the, I think there's a precedent now set that all of the lower Mekong mainstream dams, of which there will be 12, will very likely be run-of-the-river dams. The first two are. But let's also remember about the other things that flow through rivers, like the environmental flows of fish migration and sediment. And run-of-the-river dams cannot necessarily address that. That's just something to keep in mind. I see there's an e-flow comment in the chat as well.
Right, indeed. And I also recognize that a number of audience members have asked questions about data and how they can access data. I wanted to reassure the audience that we will be sharing information about the various data sources that have been shown today in the thank you email that will be sent to all of the registrants for this webinar. And in addition to that, in the thank you email, you will also see a video recording of this webinar. But also in that thank you email, we will be sharing certain reading materials. But to that, I wanted to ask all four of our panelists to recommend a book or an article, excuse me, or a film or anything that you would recommend to our audience members who wish to learn more about the topics that you just talked about today. Judy, can we begin with you, or do you need a little more time to think about it?
Well, I wasn't really ready, but I was going to say, well, Brian Eiler's book on the last days of the mating Mekong is really good. But there's a movie, I just trying to remember the name of it. It's called Salt, or The Story of Salt or something. And it shows the Tibetan nomads going to pick up salt. And then does anybody know the name of this movie? Something about salt. But to give you a sense of the landscape, there's also a movie called Himalaya, which I really recommend to students. It's just the landscape is so stark, and you see these yaks, migrating along these tiny paths with like ravines down on the other side. So I think, I thought you were going to ask me my final thought. My final thought is that presumably everybody who's in this conference already understands that the third pole is the water tower of the world and an incredibly important part of global ecology. But if we could all work harder on educating the public and our students as to the importance of this, because everybody knows about the polar bear and everybody knows about the penguins, but not enough people understand that this is the third pole, right? So I think that this whole effort is going to contribute to raising that awareness. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Judy. And Brian, tell your last word and your recommendation.
Oh boy, last words are hard. Yeah, there are some reasons for optimism if we can think about these river basins from a perspective of integrated water management. Think about them not just as, managing them for economic benefits and hydropower, but for environmental flows, thinking about the cultural and social values of rivers as well. It does get a lot more complicated when we talk about international relations around rivers and the geopolitics of that. The resource that I wanted to mention, I thought a little bit about this. It's kind of hard to narrow it down, but one thing that I've been looking at recently is called the Environmental Justice Atlas. I don't know if people have seen this. Some scholars in Spain have put it together, and it's a geo-referenced website that basically looks at environmental conflicts and disputes. And not all of these are water related. Some of them are around pollution or development-induced displacement or whatever. But this is a really interesting resource with both qualitative narrative information and also quantitative data. So I recommend checking that out.
Thank you so much, Brian. Selena, can we come to you? Your recommendation, your final thoughts.
Okay. Well, because I do international relations and international politics, and thanks, Brian Tild, for bringing that up, because I think that one of the things that as students of the environment and this water dispute and resource disputes, we mustn't forget that geopolitics is all part of it. You need to understand the bilateral relations, the relations among all the riparian countries, and they set the context of the dispute itself. So in that light, I just want to say that it seems to to a lot of people that the upper riparian has the upper hand. I mean, China's a water tower, right, of Asia. And but it is not entirely true, because I think that lower riparians actually have ways that can encourage better cooperation and better behavior from upper riparians. In my own study of Kazakhstan and how Kazakhstan deals with China in managing the Ili and Itris rivers, I think that Kazakhstan, among all the other countries that China shares rivers with, have actually move China into more cooperative modes of more cooperation than all the other countries, all the other riparians surrounding China. So I think that looking at the Kazakh example is actually a good one. It's a much smaller country, but it deploys certain strategies to get China to respond. Obviously the people who have written all these wonderful books here, their books should be read by students and any other people who are interested in the audience. If you're interested in hydrohegemony and issues to deal with power asymmetries, with the securitization, desecularization of conflict, I would recommend the work of Mark Zeiton. Mark Zeiton, Z-E-I-T-O-U-N. He and I recently shared a panel that was organized by ITT Guwahati. And a lot of his theoretical stuff on secularization and hydrohegemony actually influences my own work. And he is actually based in the United Kingdom, in the UK. And so when it comes to that kind of stuff, he and Jerome Warner, who is from the Netherlands, they do a lot of this kind of water diplomacy kind of work. So it would be interesting for students who are interested in this kind of issues to Google them and get their work. Yeah.
Sounds great. Thank you, Selena. Hydrohegemony sounds like a concept that will generate a lot of discussion. Brian Eiler, your recommendation and final thoughts.
Thank you, Faye. Well, thank you, Judy, for mentioning my book. And Judy enjoys the honor of having the top line review at the top. But again, as Selena mentioned, the books of all these panelists, Brian's book, Dams and Development in China, really kind of started us taking a deep look at what's happening in China with dams. Judy and Ife's new book on China Goes Green. Selena's other rivers book about trains, Rivers of Iron, which is hot off the press, which she co-wrote with David Lampton. And I'm going to butcher his last name, but Selena.
Cheng-Tree Quick. So his last name is Quick. Yeah.
So please check out these books. And then another one is Dead in the Water, which came out about the same time as my book last year. We talk a lot about China, but this is about the Namtun 2 Dam, which is a World Bank sponsored and promoted dam in Laos that really kicked off Laos' damming spree, if you will. And this book demonstrates on why that was really a bad idea, not just for Laos, but also for the World Bank and its so-called Sustainable Development of Dams campaign. Just a final comment, because I want to respond to a question in the Q&A. The platform that I mentioned is something to pay attention to. It's coming out again on November 23rd. It's called the Mekong Dam Monitor. And we're again producing weekly reporting on the conditions of these numerous dams in the Mekong Basin. But importantly, the process that we use to do this is one that can easily be replicated in other basins throughout the world and throughout Asia. And once you see it, you'll see that we use freely available Sentinel satellite imagery as well as GIS applications, which are also freely available. And to make it work, it's just a matter of time and having the time and effort to put into this kind of monitoring. The technology is actually very cheap, and things are getting cheaper and cheaper. So the point is, transparency is a way forward. Citizen scientists, think tanks, NGOs really have a say in the future of these rivers, and they'll have a greater say as time passes.
Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you everyone for taking the time to join the panel. It's been such a great pleasure and honor for me to be able to moderate today's panel. I learned so much, and I look forward to a lot more conversations with you all in the future. And I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues, Sophia Kalantzakos, Mark Swislocki, and Kunda Dixit for organizing this entire conference. And I also wanted to thank a number of important people who actually are behind the scenes, but who spent tremendous amount of time making possible today's conference. They are Rashtra, Killian, Ronak, and Hannah, and a number of other student interns who were on the team as well. So thank you everybody so much for spending the time to make possible today's conference. And once again, thank you to all of our attendees from all over the world. I'm sorry that we weren't able to answer all of your questions, but please be in touch. We would love to involve you in some of our future events. Thank you, and have a great day or evening wherever you are in the world. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Yifei.
you. Thanks, Yifei. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank
Take care.
you.
You take care.
Take care.